Before Germany, before Scandinavia, before English or French, there were the Germanic tribes. Scattered through the dark forests of ancient Europe, they were warlike, deeply tribal, and fiercely free. They feared no empire, not even Rome. And yet, over centuries, these wild peoples would fracture, migrate, and evolve into some of the most powerful civilizations in human history. In this video, we'll trace their journey, from primitive warriors on the banks of the Rhine to emperors, kings, conquerors, and modern citizens of the world. The Germanic legacy is written across Europe, from England to Italy, Iceland to Spain, and even across the Atlantic. This is the full story of the Germanic migrations, the early Germanic tribes. The term Germanic doesn't refer to a single tribe. It refers to a linguistic and cultural group that emerged in northern Europe, likely between the Elbe River and the Baltic Sea, sometime around 500 BCE. These people spoke a Proto-Germanic language and shared common gods, warrior codes, and clan-based societies. They lived in forests, built no cities, and had no writing, until they came into contact with Rome. Among the earliest known Germanic tribes were the Suebi and Chatti, Cherusci, Marcomanni, Hermunduri, and Semnones. Their names are strange, their stories often half legend, but they formed the backbone of what would later become the Goths, Franks, Anglo-Saxons, and Scandinavians. In 9 AD, a coalition of Germanic warriors under Arminius of the Cherusci annihilated 3 Roman legions in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, a stunning defeat that shook the empire. Arminius, also known by his German name Hermann, was a Cherusci war chief and former Roman auxiliary officer who led one of the most significant and shocking defeats in Roman history, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. Key facts about Arminius, born around 18 or 17 BC in Germania, likely of noble birth within the Cherusci tribe. Roman upbringing. As a youth, Arminius was taken to Rome as part of a diplomatic arrangement and trained in Roman military tactics. He earned Roman citizenship and even became a knight eques, military career. Arminius served as an officer in the Roman auxiliary forces, fighting in the Balkans and rising through the ranks. His Roman training would later be key to his strategy. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest 9 AD, at a time when Rome was attempting to pacify and incorporate Germania east of the Rhine, Arminius secretly united several Germanic tribes who were tired of Roman rule. He tricked the Roman governor Publius Quinctilius Varus into marching 3 Roman legions deep into unfamiliar forested territory. Over several days of ambushes, rain, and chaos in the Teutoburg Forest, Arminius's forces annihilated 3 full Roman legions, some 15 to 20,000 troops. It was one of Rome's worst military defeats and a devastating psychological blow. Varus committed suicide on the battlefield. Legacy of Arminius. The defeat ended Roman expansion east of the Rhine. Emperor Augustus is said to have walked the halls of his palace shouting, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Arminius became a symbol of German resistance and unity centuries later, especially during the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. In the 1800s, a massive monument called the Hermannsdenkmal, Hermann Monument, was built in his honor in Germany, and he is sometimes referred to as the father of German independence. Though later betrayed and assassinated by rival Germanic leaders around 21 AD, Arminius's ambush changed the course of Roman imperial strategy and preserved Germanic tribal autonomy for centuries. From that point on, Rome never again attempted to fully conquer Germania east of the Rhine. Germanic tribes were fiercely independent, with no unified kingdom or leadership. But something changed in the 3rd to 6th centuries AD, what historians call the migration period or Völkerwanderung. Under pressure from the Huns, population changes, and internal tribal conflicts, the Germanic tribes moved, violently and decisively, into the heart of the Roman world. And so begins the transformation, from wandering tribes to the founders of modern Europe. Let's begin with one of the most infamous, the Visigoths. The Visigoths were a western branch of the larger Gothic people who likely originated from Scandinavia before migrating southward into what is now Ukraine and Romania. Pressured by the Huns in the late 4th century, the Visigoths pushed into the Roman Empire. In 378 AD, they delivered a devastating blow to Rome at the Battle of Adrianople, killing Emperor Valens and humiliating the once invincible Roman legions. But their most famous act came in 410 AD, when King Alaric I led the sack of Rome itself, the first time the Eternal City had fallen in over 800 years. It was a symbolic death knell for the Western Roman Empire. After plundering Italy, the Visigoths migrated west and founded a kingdom in Hispania, modern-day Spain and Portugal. They ruled until 711 AD, when the Islamic Umayyad Caliphate invaded from North Africa. Still, Visigothic influence lived on, in Spanish law codes, noble bloodlines, and even early medieval architecture. The Ostrogoths. While the Visigoths moved west, their eastern cousins, the Ostrogoths, set their sights on Italy. In 493 AD, under Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogoths seized control of the Italian peninsula and established a kingdom with Ravenna as its capital. Unlike many conquerors, Theodoric preserved Roman administration, engineering, and culture. He even styled himself a successor to Roman emperors, despite being a barbarian warlord. But their rule was short-lived. In the 500s and 30s, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I launched the Gothic War, reclaiming Italy and crushing the Ostrogothic state. Still, the Ostrogoths left their mark, bridging the Roman and medieval worlds during one of the empire's final gasps. If there's a tribe whose name history has distorted, it's the Vandals. Originally from Central Europe, they stormed through Gaul, crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, and finally leapt across the Mediterranean to North Africa. In 439 AD, they captured Carthage, Rome's old nemesis, and built a powerful naval kingdom. In 455, they sacked Rome just like the Visigoths, but with far more destruction. That event led to the word vandalism, though some historians argue they weren't any more destructive than their peers. The Vandal kingdom lasted nearly 100 years before being wiped out by the Byzantines during Justinian's reconquests. The Lombards. The Lombards were another Germanic tribe that had been lurking in the shadows, fighting, migrating, adapting, until the year 568 AD, when they crossed the Alps and invaded northern Italy. They filled the vacuum left by the collapse of the Ostrogoths and the weakening of Byzantine control. Their name survives today in the Italian region of Lombardy, home to cities like Milan. The Lombards ruled much of Italy for over 2 centuries, blending Germanic tribal customs with Roman law and Christian faith. Although their rule was eventually crushed by Charlemagne in 774 AD, they left a permanent mark on Italian identity, especially in the north, where many modern Italians carry partial Germanic ancestry from Lombard bloodlines. The Franks, the French and Germans. Of all the Germanic tribes, none had a greater long-term impact than the Franks. They originated along the Rhine and were considered barbarians by Rome until they began building something new. In 496 AD, King Clovis I converted to Christianity and united the Frankish tribes, laying the foundation of what would become France. Under the Merovingians, and later the Carolingians, the Franks established a powerful empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to modern-day Germany. The most famous of all Frankish kings was Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD. His empire eventually split, and West Francia evolved into France, absorbing Latin and Roman culture. East Francia became the foundation of the Holy Roman Empire, and later Germany. So yes, both the French and the Germans are, in many ways, children of the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the English. When the Romans withdrew from Britain in the early 400s, they left behind a power vacuum. Into that void came the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, Germanic tribes from what is now Germany and Denmark. These tribes invaded, settled and conquered the native Britons, pushing many of them west into Wales and Cornwall. By the 600s, they had carved Britain into several kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. Their language, Old English, was a fusion of Germanic dialects that evolved over time into modern English. They held the land until 1066, when William the Conqueror, a Norman but also Viking-descended duke from France, invaded and took the crown. Still, the Anglo-Saxon roots remained, in language, culture, and the very identity of England. But while the Anglo-Saxons built England, their northern cousins were still sailing, raiding, and expanding, launching the most feared invasions in Europe, the Scandinavians. While many Germanic tribes sought to conquer land and build kingdoms, the Scandinavians had something more primal in mind: raiding, seafaring, and legend-making. These northern Germanic tribes, the Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, retained their paganism longer than their southern cousins, worshipping gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja, while the rest of Europe embraced Christianity. Beginning in the 8th century, these seafaring warriors exploded out of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, launching the era we now call the Viking Age. The Viking raids and expansion. The Danes raided the British Isles, eventually settling in eastern England, the Danelaw, and founding cities like York. The Norwegians sailed west to the British Isles, Ireland, the Faroe Islands, and even the North Atlantic. The Swedes, meanwhile, turned east, navigating the rivers of modern Russia, founding trade routes and cities, and even reaching the Byzantine Empire and Baghdad. According to the primary chronicle, a 12th century Rusi's chronicle, the East Slavic tribes invited the Varangians, Scandinavian, mostly Swedish Vikings, to rule over them and bring order to the region. In 862, Rurik and his kin arrived, and Rurik established control in Ladoga and later in Novgorod. And his rule marks the beginning of the Rurikid dynasty, which would go on to rule much of Rusis and later Russia for centuries. Key milestones: Oleg of Novgorod, likely Rurik's relative or regent, moved south and captured Kiev around 882 AD, uniting Novgorod and Kiev and founding what became known as Kievan Rusis. Rurik's descendants ruled Kievan Rusis, and after its decline, they ruled the various principalities that emerged, including Vladimir Suzdal, Galicia Volhynia, and Moscow. The Muscovite branch of the Rurikids eventually evolved into the Tsardom of Russia. End of the Rurikid dynasty. The dynasty continued through the rulers of Moscow until the death of Tsar Fyodor I in 1598, who died without an heir. These Norse explorers didn't just pillage, they founded settlements, kingdoms, and entire cultures. Iceland, the last free Norse society. One of the most fascinating Norse offshoots was Iceland. Settled primarily by Norwegians in the 9th and 10th centuries, Iceland became a haven for exiles, warriors, and chieftains who wanted freedom from the growing monarchies of Scandinavia. Iceland developed a parliamentary system, the Althing, founded in 930 AD, which still exists today. It was in Iceland that Norse oral tradition was preserved in writing. The Eddas, sagas, and poetic epics that tell the stories of Odin, Thor, and Ragnarok. Iceland was also one of the last places in Europe to convert to Christianity, doing so around 1000 AD, but in a uniquely democratic vote. Despite the conversion, Old Norse religion and identity remained deeply embedded in Icelandic literature and folklore for centuries. Iceland became a time capsule of early Germanic paganism and heroic lore. Greenland, the edge of the known world. In the late 900s, Eric the Red, an outlaw from Iceland, led a group westward and founded settlements in Greenland, so named, legend says, to attract settlers. These Norse colonies survived for several centuries, farming and fishing in harsh conditions, but ultimately vanished, possibly due to climate change, resource scarcity, and isolation. Still, their boldness marked the furthest western reach of Germanic expansion before the discovery of North America. His son, Leif Erikson, would go even farther, reaching Vinland, in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, some 500 years before Columbus. The Normans, from Vikings to French lords. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation of the Norse came in France, where Norse raiders became Christian dukes. In 911 AD, the West Frankish king granted land to a Viking leader named Rollo in exchange for peace. That land became Normandy, or Land of the Northmen. Within a century, these Normans were thoroughly French in language and culture, but retained their warrior spirit. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England, defeating the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings and becoming King William I, better known as William the Conqueror. From that moment on, the English crown had Viking blood, French language, and Germanic roots. The Scandinavians didn't just raid, they shaped laws, languages, royal bloodlines, and the very geography of Europe. Their legacy lives on in the Icelandic sagas, the English royal family, and even in the genetic markers across the British Isles and northern France. The Alemanni and Bavarians, while the Goths, Franks, and Anglo-Saxons were carving kingdoms across Europe, other Germanic tribes stayed closer to home, especially in the southern Germanic heartlands. One such group was the Alemanni. First mentioned by the Romans in the 3rd century, the Alemanni were a confederation of Germanic tribes living in what is now southwestern Germany, Alsace, Switzerland, and parts of Austria. Though they frequently clashed with Rome, sometimes breaching deep into Gaul, they were eventually subdued and absorbed by the expanding Frankish kingdom under Clovis I, but their name endured far beyond their independence. Even today, in French, Spanish, and Portuguese, the word for German is Allemande, Aleman, or Alemão, all derived from Alemanni. The Bavarians, another southern Germanic group, emerged in the early medieval period, centered in what's now Bavaria, Germany's largest state. They developed a distinct identity with their own customs, dialect, and even fashion. Over time, they became a semi-autonomous duchy under the Holy Roman Empire. Ask any German today, and they'll tell you, Bavaria isn't just a region, it's a people. Bavarians are known for preserving folk traditions, Catholic heritage, and a proud cultural distinctiveness that separates them from northern Germans. From beer halls and lederhosen to the Bavarian dialect, their culture remains iconic both within Germany and abroad. The Dutch and the birth of the Netherlands. While the Franks were building a new empire across France and Germany, a unique offshoot of Germanic culture was developing along the North Sea coast, in the low-lying marshlands that would one day become the Netherlands. The tribes who lived there, the Batavians, Frisians, and Saxons, were Germanic but distinct. Under Roman influence, some were recruited as elite auxiliary troops. But after Rome's collapse, these coastal Germanic peoples remained semi-independent, forming a culture rooted in farming, fishing, and mercantile trade. The rise of the Dutch identity. By the Middle Ages, These lands became part of the Frankish Empire and later the Holy Roman Empire, but they retained a strong local culture and dialect, distinct from both French and German. Over time, this dialect evolved into Middle Dutch, the direct ancestor of modern Dutch. Dutch is a West Germanic language, closely related to German and English, but with its own unique flavor. In the 16th century, the Dutch provinces rebelled against their overlord, the Catholic Spanish Habsburgs, during the 80 Years' War. The result? The creation of the Dutch Republic, an independent, Protestant, merchant-led nation founded in 1581. A maritime Germanic power, the Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century saw the Netherlands become a global naval and trade power. They built an empire stretching to the East Indies, South Africa, and the Caribbean. Dutch explorers, scientists, and thinkers helped define the early modern world. Though Germanic in language and ancestry, the Dutch developed their own proud identity, defined by commerce, tolerance, independence, and seafaring dominance. Legacy. Today, the Dutch are one of the most linguistically and culturally recognizable branches of the Germanic family tree. The Afrikaans language of South Africa even descends directly from 17th-century Dutch settlers, making it a modern offshoot of the migration story. From tribal marshes to global trade hubs, the Dutch carved their path through history as a fierce, adaptable, and resilient people. German migration to South America. The story of the Germanic peoples doesn't end in Europe. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Europe modernized and industrialized, millions of Germans left their homeland, seeking land, freedom, and opportunity overseas. While many went to the United States, a large number sailed south to South America, where they founded towns, preserved their language, and created unique cultural enclaves that still exist to this day. Brazil, the heart of German South America. Beginning in the 1820s, the Empire of Brazil encouraged German immigration to help colonize and cultivate its southern territories. Tens of thousands of Germans settled in Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná, fertile regions that reminded them of their native lands. These settlers brought with them their language, religion, architecture, and folk traditions, and passed them down for generations. Today, there are still towns in Brazil where German dialects are spoken, most notably Hansrukisch, a Moselle Franconian dialect, and Rio Grandense Hansrukisch is even recognized as a cultural heritage language by the state of Rio Grande do Sul. Cities like Blumenau and Pomerode are famous for their Oktoberfests, timber-framed houses, and cultural fusion of Brazilian and Germanic identity. Argentina and Chile. In Argentina, German immigrants settled in Buenos Aires, Entre Rios, and the Patagonia region. In Chile, German settlers arrived mainly in Valdivia, Osorno, and Lanquihue. These communities helped shape local economies, infrastructure, and education systems. In southern Chile, German-Chilean identity remains strong, and German is still taught in many schools. Some of these communities, especially in Chile and Paraguay, attracted attention post-World War II for harboring Nazi fugitives. But the vast majority of German immigrants came decades earlier, as peaceful settlers seeking opportunity. Legacy. In South America today, as of the 21st century, there are millions of South Americans with partial or full German ancestry, and an estimated 2 to 3 million German speakers across the continent, though most are now bilingual in Spanish or Portuguese. Their legacy survives in N-language schools, and Lutheran and Catholic churches, and festivals and architecture, and even in dual citizenship laws offered by Germany to descendants. From Bavaria to Blumenau, from the Rhine to the rainforest, the Germanic migration shaped not only Europe, but the New World. Their descendants in South America stand as a living reminder that migration didn't end in the Middle Ages. It continued quietly into the modern age. German migration to the United States. Of all the migrations by Germanic peoples, none had a more lasting impact on American culture than the arrival of the Germans in the United States. Between the late 1600s and early 1900s, more than 7 million Germans crossed the Atlantic, making them the largest ethnic immigrant group in U.S. history. Today, over 40 million Americans, about 1 in 8, claim German ancestry, where they settled. Germans didn't just cluster in one region, they shaped the heart of the American Midwest. They settled in Pennsylvania, home to the early religious refugees known as Pennsylvania Dutch Deutsch, Zwoich, Wisconsin. Milwaukee became known as the German Athens. In Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, especially Cincinnati and Chicago. Missouri, St. Louis became a major German hub. Minnesota, Iowa, and Texas, especially hill country. In these regions, German immigrants built entire towns, churches, newspapers, and cultural societies. Cultural contributions. German Americans didn't just adapt to America, they transformed it. Beer brewing. Germans revolutionized American beer. They brought brewing techniques from Bavaria and founded legendary breweries like Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, and Miller, turning cities like Milwaukee and St. Louis into beer capitals. Food. The hot dog is derived from German Frankfurters and Wieners. The hamburger has roots in Hamburg, Germany. And then Germans also introduced pretzels, bratwurst, sauerkraut, and potato salad. The tradition of the Christmas tree Tannenbaum was brought by German settlers. Education, philosophy. Germans promoted kindergarten education based on Friedrich Froebel's model. They also brought gymnastic societies Turnverein, which later evolved into public gymnasiums and athletic clubs, and music and arts. German immigrants founded orchestras, choirs, and music halls, particularly in Cincinnati and New York. Work ethic and civic life. They emphasized clean governance, community organizations, and the value of hard work and thrift, challenges and suppression. Despite their influence, German Americans faced serious backlash during World War I. Schools stopped teaching German, towns renamed themselves, German books were burned. In World War II, suspicion resurfaced, though less violently. Still, the culture endured, quietly blending into the American fabric while leaving unmistakable fingerprints behind. Legacy today. You can still find German heritage alive in Oktoberfest celebrations from Texas to Ohio, medicinal bakeries and beer gardens, and German-American festivals and clubs, and Midwestern values of community, order, and industriousness. From farming tools to festive beer steins, from the hamburger to the kindergarten, the Germanic tribes came full circle, building not just a nation, but a culture that remains deeply embedded in the American way of life. Conclusion. From mist-shrouded forests and wooden war halls to the skyscrapers of Chicago and the fjords of Scandinavia, the story of the Germanic peoples is one of the most powerful migration sagas in human history. They began as tribes without writing, resisting the Roman Empire, united only by language, kinship, and culture. But over the course of 2,000 years, they transformed the map of Europe and left their mark across the world. They became the Goths who sacked Rome, the Franks who built France and Germany, and the Anglo-Saxons who gave birth to England, a Norseman who explored, raided, and settled from Greenland to Baghdad, the Dutch who built a maritime empire, and the millions of immigrants who shaped the Americas, bringing with them new traditions, new faiths, and new lives. Today, their legacy lives on in in languages like English, German, Dutch, and the Scandinavian tongues, and in customs like the Christmas tree, beer brewing, and even your weekly calendar, and in the bloodlines and cultures of people from Iceland to South Africa, Minnesota to Sao Paulo. This is more than history. It's the story of how tribes became kingdoms and kingdoms became nations, how migration shapes identity, and how even the humblest of origins can echo across millennia. Like, subscribe, and share to help keep this history alive. And stay tuned for more epic stories of ancient peoples who still shape the modern world.